All right. Good morning to you all. Thanks for joining me today. Today we're going to actually switch yet again. I know this class moves real fast, but we're going to move from InDesign into the third and final Adobe product, which is Illustrator. And the nice thing about Illustrator is it's very close and very similar to InDesign. So it's a very natural transition. To me, the jump from Photoshop into either InDesign or Illustrator is kind of a big one because they're very different pieces of software. The jump from InDesign into Illustrator, they're kind of almost the same piece of software. Before InDesign was written by Adobe as a piece of software, we did a lot of the things that we do now in InDesign in Illustrator. So the idea of placing objects, those are all kind of crossovers from the world of Illustrator back in the day, and now they're in InDesign. So we're going to move a little bit into Illustrator. Really what we're going to be practicing today is the pen tool. And this doesn't matter whether you're doing it in InDesign, you're doing it in Illustrator, or ultimately you're doing it in Photoshop, because there is the pen tool available in Photoshop. We just didn't cover it in the Photoshop section. But the pen tool just takes a lot of practice. So we'll spend a lot of time working on the pen tool today, and I'll walk you through how the pen tool works, and then you'll get a bunch of practice at it. But in the meantime, I also want to talk about kind of a broader topic of what's the difference between Photoshop and Illustrator, or Photoshop and InDesign. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And then give me just a second to get organized. Oops, come on. Come on, Zoom windows. Perfect. And so what I'm going to do is we're going to talk about the difference between vector graphics and raster graphics, which is essentially what's the difference between Illustrator and Photoshop, and why do we use one over the other in a particular circumstance. So when we start talking about vector and raster graphics, we first have to understand what each of them are, because they're very different. Raster graphics are essentially a file that's made up of a bunch of little squares, and each one of those little squares has a particular color. And when we look at it from far away, all of those little squares, those little pixels, kind of blend together and give us the overall shape of our image. And this is something we're actually very familiar with, because every piece of paper that we pick up, everything physical that's been printed, is actually made up of little tiny dots, but our eyes perceive them as a whole document. Furthermore, our screens are made up of little tiny dots, but they're so small we can't see them, and we perceive an overall sense of color out of it. So the same thing happens with a raster graphics file. We've got all these individual colors, and when we look at it far enough away, we see an overall image. So in this example on the right here, you can see that the flower, when we blow it up, when we zoom in on it, is made up of those individual colored pixels. There are some distinct advantages to raster graphics. Because they're just individual colored pixels, we can perform pixel by pixel corrections. We can edit a particular pixel and not edit the pixel next door. So it helps us in photorealistic final image output. It's much easier to edit when lots of complex colors involved. And you can see that as naturally in the kinds of edits we did in Photoshop. The levels adjustment, the curves adjustment, those are all things that we can do in a raster graphic. We can also add certain kinds of fancy effects because they're raster graphics and they're being applied just to pixels. It does, however, have some distinct disadvantages. So we have some advantages, but we also have some disadvantages. And the big one is that whenever you zoom in, at some point you see the individual squares. So if we keep zooming in, we're going to end up seeing those squares. The other thing is that because every one of those squares, every one of those pixels is defined by a particular color, the file sizes get really large. That's why photo files are relatively big. Video files are relatively big because they're just a series of still photos that are all put together in a video. So it's lots and lots of information that balloons the file size. That also means that raster images take more computer horsepower, more memory, more bandwidth, more scratch disk space, etc., to work with. So we need to have all that extra computer support to be able to work with those files. That's why, for example, Photoshop tends to be a resource hog on your computer. If you have Photoshop open, it likes to crash other programs or consume all the resources that you have available, because that's the kind of files that it's dealing with. Vector graphics, on the other hand, so that was raster graphics, individual pixel by pixel color. Vector graphics are mathematically defined graphics. So they're defined by shapes, or these curves or these lines define a particular shape, and then they have a particular fill color. So if we think about a large square, let's say it's a 2-inch by 2-inch square. If it's made up of little tiny pixels, we have to have every one of those pixels with a coordinate and a color assigned to it. And it's, it could be 1,000,000 pixels depending on the resolution. If we define it in vector graphics, we say square starts at point 0, 0, square ends at 2, 2 in an XY plane. We connect the dots and we form a square. And the fill of that square is blue, for example. So it's very little information. So the files tend to be a little bit lighter as they start to create. So what are the advantages of vector graphics? Well, the big one is that we have scalable images. So you can keep enlarging the image without getting any distortion or without getting any jagged edges on the side, as big as you want. You could take a vector graphic that was small, something that was printed on an envelope or something, and you could blow it up the size of a billboard. And as long as it's a vector graphic, there won't be any distortion. That's pretty neat. The file sizes tend to be really small, and the file size is independent of the actual size of the image. So it doesn't matter whether it's a small, something that goes on an envelope or something that goes on a billboard, it's still the same size. That means it's a lot easier for the computer to work on, less resources required, etc. So you're saying, well, wait a minute, that vector graphic thing sounds great. Why don't we do everything in vector graphics? Well, vector graphics don't work well for things like photographs or complex color ranges. So the best example is the one over here on the right of this particular image, because you can really see it. If we look at this image, that is a vector graphic. Put a V over here for vector. And you can see that there's kind of blotchiness in certain regions that represent, certain colors. Almost looks a little bit more drawn. The photograph version, the raster graphic, this one, that one we see an infinite distribution of specific colors. So they're fundamentally very different. So vector images are not good for photographs or images with high complexity color. The other thing is that vector graphics format, like a .eps, for example, is a little bit more specialized. Certainly they're common. There's lots of graphic designers that work with them, but they're not quite as universal as a JPEG or a PNG. So when do we use one versus the other? Well, if it's a raster image, we're looking at photographs or high dynamic range images, things with complex color. So we're going to be using those in relationship to things like Photoshop or maybe V-Ray. Vector graphics, on the other hand, are your line drawings. They could be architectural line drawings, they could be logos, they could be fonts. And this is a perfect example. You guys have done this your whole life and you probably never realized it. A font is fundamentally a vector graphic because you can increase the size of the font and the edges are still smooth. You can keep increasing that size as big as you want. So it is a vector graphic. It's a mathematically defined graphic. So let's look at a side-by-side comparison. So in this example, they're talking about the logo that's right here, right? That logo here. The resolution of that logo in 3 different sizes, we see that our vector size stays consistent the whole time. So it doesn't matter the size. Like I said, it could be the size of a billboard and it would still be the same size. If we look at the raster size, this one says bitmap, but what they mean is raster. Right? Raster size, the small one is still pretty small. It's still bigger than the vector size, but it's still pretty small. But as we increase, notice how much larger these file sizes get as they balloon. So here's another example, right? Same logo, we blow it up to 1600%, and if it's a vector graphic, the edges are still perfectly smooth. If we take the same logo that's been rasterized. It's a raster graphic now. Notice that when we blow it up to 16%, we just get these big square chunks. So there's a fundamental difference there. So if you were designing a logo, you'd want to be doing that in a vector-based program. So computer programs, raster is going to be Photoshop or V-Ray. Your vector programs are going to be things like Illustrator, InDesign, AutoCAD, Vectorworks, Revit, Rhino. A lot of the big design software is all, 3D Fusion, 3D Studio Max. I mean, you name it, they're almost always vector-based. So think photographs, think raster. Everything else is probably vector. So we're using Illustrator, we're using InDesign for their intended purposes. So we're not editing photos in them. We're using them for their intended purposes. Likewise, we're not doing graphic layouts, we're not doing fonts, we're not drawing in Photoshop because it can't be scaled up, it can't be changed once it's done. So we're doing our drawings in a vector-based program. So there is this fundamental difference. So like I said, today's lecture itself wasn't that long because we'll spend a little bit more time actually talking about Illustrator today. So I went ahead and I pulled up what we're doing today. This is exercise 113. And what you'll be doing, we're going to use a font design. We're going to be designing our own font, not because the end font is going to be spectacular, but because it's great practice for the pen tool. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll come back to this page in just a second. But while we're waiting, I want to open up Illustrator. So let me open up the Adobe folder here and we'll open up Illustrator. Got to give it its time to get loaded up here. Perfect. I'm going to go ahead and close this. And instead of picking one of the presets, we'll get to the place where we start picking presets. But for right now, instead of picking a preset, I'm going to pick a file. And so if we jump back to our exercise 113 for today, and we scroll down to the bottom, you'll see that I have an Illustrator template for exercise 113. You certainly don't have to use my template, but I think it's a lot easier if you use my template. So I would encourage you to do that. I'm going to right click on it and say save link as, and I'll put it on my flash drive into a folder. It's such amazing how I say flash drive because it's just habit of saying that. Into my OneDrive, excuse me. Let's make a name for this. This is fall of 2022. And then I will go ahead and save this. So this is, remember I have to hit that arrow and choose keep. This is from a website called Calligrapher. I think the spelling's a little weird. There you go, it's this website here. And they'll actually let you create a font. They make you log in to be able to do it, but you can basically download a template and then you can actually write on the template, scan it, and send it to them, and they'll make a font of your handwriting and whatever. It's kind of a cool concept. So we're using that as kind of a base for this, though you won't actually be creating the font. That's optional at the end. But the template that I created is based on one of their little worksheets. So we've gone ahead and we've saved it. So over here in Illustrator, I'll go to Open, and I'm going to navigate to my OneDrive and into today's folder. And I'll go ahead and open up that template. Okay, so it's gone ahead and it's open. Let's talk through a little bit of detail about what's happening here in Illustrator. So when we first open Illustrator, you'll notice that it looks an awful lot like InDesign. Actually, it's almost the same as InDesign. And the setup is very similar, where we have a toolbar on the left side, we have our typical file menu structure up at the top, we have our general properties, below that we have our layers. So everything looks very similar to what we're seeing in InDesign. And as I work with it, all the key commands work the same. So Control plus, for example, will let me zoom in. Control 0 will show me the whole page. All of those commands are the same. Let's do Control plus here, and we can start to see what I've set up as a template for us. So if we move over here to the right just a little bit, by the way, I can hold down spacebar to pan. You'll see that I've given you some guides. I have an X height, I have a baseline, I have a descender, I have an ascender, and you can use those to your advantage in each of these little squares as we create it. However, before we actually get started, the default starts here at capital W, and then we move into the lower cases. I want to start with the capital letters. So I'm going to open up the layers palette over here on the right. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on this font page 2 right there. And I'm going to turn off the font page 1. Why did it not? I love it when things don't move. Yeah, there we go. What did I do? Something. Ah, yes, sorry. I can't even read my own. Okay, I have 2 pages here, page 1 and page 2. These 2 pages represent the 2 pages that are the background templates. Okay, so I want to start on page 1. So I'm going to make page 1 visible. I'll click that little eyeball. I will turn off page 2. I'm going to leave the guides on. And then I'm going to turn off font page 2, and I'll turn on font page 1 right here. And I want to make that the active layer. So I'll highlight it so it's active. That means when I start to draw my characters, they'll show up on this font page 1 layer. Okay, so I want to make sure. Some people will end up on the wrong layer, and they'll go to use the pen tool, and they'll get that little symbol with the circle and the line through it saying you can't draw. It's because you're not on the font page 1 layer. When I do that, then I'll actually be able to start drawing. So let's come down here. I'm going to skip over the numbers, and I'm going to start with the capital letter A. And like I said, we're working with the pen tool today. So it's this tool right here. When I click on that pen tool, the way that the pen tool works is it allows us to create basically line segments, but it also allows us to create curves. We'll start with straight line segments. So over here at the A, as I start to create it, I'm going to start down here at the bottom of my baseline, and I will do a single click. That's going to start my line. Then I'll come up to the cap height right here, and I'll go ahead and do a single click right there. And you can see that I've created that first little line segment. And then I'll come down here to the bottom, and I'll get to where I'm approximately symmetrical, and I'll go ahead and I'll click one more time. When I'm done, I'll come back up here to my black arrow and finish. This has then created a line that goes up and then a line that comes back down. This happens to be filled in with white. So if I look over here at my fill color and my stroke color, we can see that my fill color is white. It doesn't matter because we're not seeing it here, but sometimes when we create a more complicated shape, we won't want to have that start to fill in with white. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that so that it's transparent, so it's not filling anything in. Then I'll come back to my pen tool, and I need to create the crossbar on the pen. So a couple things to point out. If I hover my mouse over my existing line, you see that my pen tool changes to where it has a little plus. What that'll do is it'll add a control point at that place. That's not starting a new line, it's adding a control point. So that's actually what I don't want to do. So instead, I'll use the pen tool, and instead of starting right on that, I'll move over a little bit and I'll start a line, say right there. And when I come over, then it'll snap to that intersection and it'll create that point. I'll come up and I'll choose my black arrow, and that line is now finished. Now, I don't want this kind of extending past, so I can select it, and then I could use my my resize tool to actually adjust it. And let me do Control plus to zoom in a little bit more. There we go. And we can start to see what's happening here. So I've shortened that up so that it's lined up. So in order to create that crossbar, I went over here and I drew over to there. I went back to my black arrow, and then I shortened that crossbar till it matches up. And that one's not quite long enough. It needs to go a little bit more. Now, we also have the option, rather than moving this using those scale tools, is we can use the white arrow, which is called the direct select tool. We're going to get really familiar with the direct select tool today. And what the direct select tool does is it allows me to pick just a control point. So I can choose just this endpoint right here, and I can move just that endpoint around. So I can move it until it comes over and intersects with that line, creating that crossbar there. Obviously, I may not want both of those, so we can use our our regular select tool, our black arrow, to select it, press the delete key, and that's going to go away. Sometimes you want to see this a little bit thicker. We can do that by selecting it and then increasing our stroke. So let me come over to our properties. It's at 1 point right now. I could increase it up, let's say to 3 point. Now we'll do it at 4 point, just so you can kind of see it with its thickness. So let's move on to another letter. I'll use Control 0 to zoom out. We want to move down here into the B. So let's do Control plus a few times. I'll use spacebar to pan. Let me Control plus a couple more times. There we go. And now I need to create the capital B. So if I were to use the pen tool again, obviously creating the back side of the B is easy. You can come over here and draw the back side of the B. And I could come over and draw the bottom. But when we start to get to the actual loop of the B, right, we could draw it just in straight segments like this, for example. Or we could draw it where we start to add a curve. And so this is the part of the pen tool that really takes a lot of practice. And I'll be honest, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I have a lot of practice drawing with the pen tool. So when I make this letter, it will end up looking easy. It's not easy. It takes a lot of practice. So that's what today is fundamentally about. So rather than doing a single click here to create that straight line segment, I'm going to click and hold, then I'll drag a tangent line. And you can see that as I start to drag that tangent line, it will create an arc. So now instead of having a straight segment there, I have an arc. And you'll see that this top side, I can come over here and kind of continue that arc. Now, rather than click and hold here, I want it to end. So I'm going to go ahead and just click once, and that's going to end that part of the B. Then we'll come over to right here. Again, I'm going to get close. If I need to draw it perfectly straight, I can hold down Shift as I draw, and I can click. Now, I'm not clicking all the way over on top of the line. I'm leaving a little bit of a gap there on purpose. I'll come back and fix that a little bit later on. Let me go back to my pen tool. I'm going to start up here at the top. Notice that when I hover my mouse over that endpoint, I get a slash instead of a star. That means I'm going to continue from that endpoint. So I'll come over here, draw a little bit out. There we go. I'm going to click and hold at about this halfway point, drag to create that part of the B. And then I'm going to come down, oops, come on, and get close to my bottom like that. Then I'll come in and fine tune things. So I'll use my white arrow, my direct select tool, to adjust. So we'll start with this point. I'm going to click and pull it down so that it ends up on top of this letter. Furthermore, I'll take this point and I'll pull it over. And then I'm going to look at my tangent lines. So it looks like this tangent line is a little bit high. So I might need to pull that down. I might need to pull it out. And I may need to adjust the curvature after the fact. So I can come in here and adjust that tangent so that it's nice and smooth. Furthermore, this one looks like a little bit high. We'll pull that down just a bit. And then maybe we'll pull this up just a little bit. And that's starting to create my shape here. Maybe this is too far. Maybe we need to pull that one back in like that. And pretty soon you've created the letter B. So again, it's a different strategy. And this takes practice to get used to, right? The fewer points you use, the better. And this is one of the tendencies of people. They say, okay, let me create the D. So we'll start here. I'm going to hold down Shift to keep it vertical. There it is. We'll come over here a little bit. And then we're going to, start a point here, and we'll put another point here and another point here. And there's my D. Now, it's not exactly what we were going for. So when you're creating these points, think about kind of the fewest points possible. So if I want a nice smooth arc, I want one point in the middle. And then I want to end there. And then we'll come across and put those two together. And then we can come back and make our adjustments. So we can say, you know what? I want that to be a little bit more arching there. Maybe I want to pull this point back a little bit to start to create my style. Maybe this point needs to come back a little bit. So we get close, and then we make our letters. That's kind of an ugly D. But anyway, you get the idea. So what about the letter C? Well, we could certainly create the letter C. This is a little bit harder because it's fully circular. We have no straight lines to work from. So I would start at the top. I'll move my way into the halfway point, click and drag to create that guide. I'd come about halfway down, click, drag to create that tangent. Come down to this point, click, drag to create the bottom part of the C. And then I come up to that last point. I'm going to click and drag just to adjust that curvature at the very end. And there it is as a C. It's not bad. I think I did a fairly good job, but that takes a lot of practice to get it right. So the other option here is that we could actually start with a shape. So I'm going to come over to my ellipse tool. And with that ellipse tool, I'll go ahead and draw the start of my C. So that's nice because it's a nice, perfectly round shape. And I didn't have to try to create it. So what I then want to do is I want to break it so I can get rid of this segment over here on this side. So I'll come back to the pen tool, and you'll see that when I hover over it, I get that little plus sign. I'll do it down here so you can see it, that little plus sign. So I can add an anchor point where I want the bottom of the C to end. So I'll add an anchor point right there. Then I'll come up here to the top, and I'll add an anchor point where I want the top to end. So now that I have those two anchor points, I can choose with the white direct select arrow, I can choose the point that's in the middle of those two anchor points. So that point right there. And when I delete that anchor point, it will delete the two line segments that are attached to that anchor point. So I'll select it, press delete, and I'll end up with just those two anchor points.
When you did the point, how can you tell that it's the same distance from the corner, from the top letter?
So the top to the bottom. Good question. So what I did was just eyeballed. So what I can do instead, let's go back to where I have that, is I can use my rulers and I could drag a line over so that I have an extra vertical guide. If I didn't want to eyeball it, I'll come back to the pen tool, and now I can choose that intersection point. Oops, sorry, I wasn't on the layer. Let me come back here. Let's go to the pen tool. Oh, you're being so annoying and not letting me pick. Sometimes you love it when they do that. Okay, so it's because the guide is on top of everything. Let's see if we can do it that way. See if it'll let me, or whether it's going to stick me. Yeah, there you go. So what I did, just to clarify, is I took my shape, I right-clicked on it and said arrange, bring to front, so that it's in front of the guide, because the order that I created it in, the guide was on top. And then once I did that, I can come over here and I can add my point there. So I'm using that as my guide. Then I'll use my white direct select arrow to select the point in between and press the delete key. If there isn't a point in between, you'll want to add an anchor point in between. So if I wanted to delete, come over here. Let's say that I wanted to delete part of this from here to, shoot. This is actually one of the things that Illustrator did recently that has driven me nuts. And that is that it changed the pen tool, you used to be able to specify, I want to pick the anchor point specifically, and it stopped allowing you to do that. I wonder if I can get into a more complex view where I can see it. Let me go back.
Professor?
Yes.
I can find font layer 1, like how to move on.
So if you want to be on font page 1 right here, and you want that to be turned on and it to be highlighted in blue.
Oh,
So if you click on the layer like that, then you'll be able to draw on that layer.
I think it does not show up. Like, I don't know how to explain it, but like, I can find like BCD.
Oh, you can't see the capital letters?
Yeah.
Turn off this page 2 and make sure that just page 1, it's down at the bottom of the layers here. So this one should be on and this one should be off.
I find it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. So anyway, they used to have the ability on the pen tool to specify I want to add anchor points. And of course, now it's being annoying and not letting me add anchor points. I bet that if I switch my layout into the Essentials Classic, that when I go to the pen tool, it's going to have the add anchor point tool. So that might be beneficial for you. I try not to make those customizations, but if I do that, and so what I did is I went over here and I changed from the Essentials workspace into the Essentials Classic. And when I did that, instead of just having the pen tool, I can click on the Add Anchor Point tool specifically. And that is a little bit more precise about, okay, now I want it there, I want it there, and I want to delete the segment in between. So I'll add a third point and then press delete, and that'll let me delete the segment in between. So in this scenario, it may be beneficial to actually go ahead and switch over into the Essentials Classic. So we've done A, B, C, and D. Let's move on to E. That's pretty straightforward. We'll start with the pen tool. You know, this is just straight line segments here. Right, and then we'll come back with another pen tool. You know, for
I assume you can hit shift to keep it straight in this program.
Yes, if you hold down shift, you'll be able to keep it straight. Like that. And actually, I think actually I didn't, yeah, my letters, I drew them all, this set, they're all big. They should have been down to, this should be the baseline. I didn't catch that right away. So I can resize these because they're supposed to be there. But yes, you can hold down shift. Shift when I'm scaling like this will be for keeping things in proportion. But when I'm drawing, if I want to keep something straight, if I hold down shift, it'll keep it straight too. So sorry that I made that mistake. Didn't notice it until I was creating the E here. All right, like that. And then we can move on to the F and whatever. You guys get the idea. I'm going to skip over some letters. Let's do the G really fast. The G, for me, I would do the ellipse tool, just like I did with the C to get started. Sorry, it's supposed to be on my baseline there. Let's see if I can get it right this time. And then just like I did before, I'd click on the Add Anchor Point tool. We'd choose where we want the top of the G to be. We choose maybe where we want the bottom of the G to be, say right there. We use the direct select, the white arrow, to pick the point in between. There it is. We'll press delete. Then we'll come back to the pen tool and we'll go from there over here into the center. Let me hold down shift to keep it straight. And there's the G. Now let's say though that I wanted this to be more straight and then arc. So I can actually get in and start to edit an individual anchor point. So let me add an anchor point right here, right there. Then I'll select that anchor point. So I'll make sure I select that anchor point. And then I can come over here and you see on my properties that I have the ability to convert to a corner or convert to smooth. So if I were to convert to a corner, we'd see that this line segment will change from being smooth to being a sharp point. So let's convert to that corner. There it is as a sharp point. Now I can take that point and I could pull it down to start to create the bottom of my G, should I want to do it that way. Now this point here still has a half of an arc. So maybe that's the style we're after. Maybe we want it to look like that. Maybe this needs to come over here and then we want to pull this out like that to start to create it. Maybe that's what we want. Or I could select this point and also make that point an angle and then maybe shorten it up a little bit. So the point is, even after you've created the points, you can edit them after the fact. So I could say, you know what, I don't really like that. I want to go back to this being a corner or being smooth. Let's go back to being smooth. Let's adjust that. And maybe I want it to look like that. So we can convert these points back and forth, which is sometimes a good strategy. Okay, so let's see. The rest of these are all okay. Let's come down here and we'll get to the capital S. So the S is very, very difficult. It's probably the most challenging of all the letters to create. When we're working with the S, remember you want as few points as possible as you start to create this. So if you were drawing it from scratch, you'd start at your first point. We'd create a point right there as the S starts. I'd create a point right about here to create the back side of the S. I'd create a point kind of right here in the middle for that S. I create another point right about there to do that part of the curve. I'd create a point right about here to do that part of the curve, and I'd end right about there. So that takes an incredible amount of practice to just get that shape. And even that, for all the practice that I've had, is not the best. So at this point, I need to come in and start to modify. So we'd say, let's drop that down. Let's drop this a little bit higher. Let's tweak this handle that way. Take this one, let's raise that one up just a little bit. And pretty soon it starts to get kind of where you want it to be. And maybe, you know, style-wise, you want that to come a little bit higher. So you keep kind of tweaking it and working with it until you get the shape that you want. The alternative to that would be to create two, sorry, I'm doing it in the T slot, would be to create two ovals, and then to modify those into your S. So I'd come over here to the Add Anchor Point tool. I choose that point there. Now I want to delete the segment that goes from that point all the way to this point, the halfway point. So at that point, I could come in with my direct select, my white arrow, choose this point here, press the delete key. That's going to delete it all the way back to here. And then I'll do the same thing on the back side. So I could add an anchor point to right there. Then I'll use my white arrow to select this point, which is halfway in between that point and that point. And when I press delete, that's going to start to put those two segments together. So in this scenario, I've got the top and I've got the bottom. These two are not connected, however. So what I can do is I can use my direct select, my white arrow again. I can select those 2 points and just those 2 points. And then I can come over here and you see under anchors, I have the ability to connect selected endpoints. So I'll click on that and it'll join those 2 endpoints together and make it a continuous line segment. And then I could come in and I could continue, you know, modifying and adjusting. I could shorten that up or whatever it is. Maybe this needs to get a little bit longer. Pull that tail out a little bit. I don't know. But the point is that that's another strategy for you can essentially build the letter out of shapes. Furthermore, right, we could take something like a U and start with a rectangle and start to modify it into this shape. So there's lots of ways of working with this, and this is really what today is about. So I'm going to click on the Add Anchor Point tool. I'll add an anchor point in between. I'll select that anchor point and I'll press delete. That gets rid of those 2 line segments. Then I could take this point down here, select it, convert it into a curve. I could take this point and I could convert that one into a curve. And I'm starting to create the shape. Now, in this scenario, it would probably be better if I added an anchor point, say right there, and I'll add an anchor point directly across right there. And then when I convert this into a curve, it will only curve the bottom part. And then we could curve that segment. And then it's a matter of kind of tweaking these two to get them to look right. So I could move that in. We could take this one and move that one in. And maybe about like that. If the U is too long, I could take these two anchor points at the bottom and we could move them up. I'm using the arrow keys on the keyboard. Sometimes that's a good strategy, because if you're using the arrow keys on the keyboard, you can kind of nudge a particular point. So it's just a different strategy. So what you've done, let me press Control-0 here to zoom out, is you're going to work through. I want you to start with the capital letters, right? Once you've finished the capital letters, you can come back here and add the numbers if you want, or you can move on. And when you move on, we're going to go back to our layers. So let me go to Window, and then let's look at layers. There it is. And when I look at the layers, I'm going to turn off page 1. I'm going to turn on page 2, which gives us our different set of letters. I'm going to turn off font page 1. I'll turn on font page 2. I'll make sure that that is highlighted, and then I can continue on with my lowercase letters. So if we were doing a G, for example, let's do that one. Right? I might start with an ellipse. So I might start with something like that. Maybe I want it to be centered. And then I'll come in with my pen tool. And let's start, I'm going to start close by here. We'll come down. I'll click. Then I'm going to move to the halfway point, click, hold, drag to create that bottom. And then we'll come back up to maybe right about there. Then I'll use my direct select tool to pull this up until it matches up right there. And that may or may not be attractive, or may not be what you're after, but this is fundamentally about practicing with the pen tool. That's what we're working on. So I'm not expecting this font to look beautiful. Every one of these letters is great practice with the pen tool to get you more and more comfortable with it. I actually used to spend, back when we had an 18-week semester, I'd spend a whole week doing this. So we'd spend a lot of time working through the details of these letters and whatever. I'm going to point out a couple other things just because sometimes people want to play around with it and have some fun with it. And that is, let me turn back. I'm going to go back to my first page here. There we go. Sometimes people want to play around with what's happening on the various letters. So for example, let's look at this A. I'll press Control+ to zoom in here. I'll hold down spacebar to move over. And if I were to take this point right here and select it, I have some ability to kind of adjust what's happening to that particular point as well. So if I select it, we can go into corners here, and we can choose what's happening at a corner. I could round the corner, for example, instead of having it come together as a sharp point. So I could say, you know what, I want to round it by 1/8 of an inch, or I could have it as a sharp point. So we have some options that are here. We have some flute options. I could chamfer the surface, and let's show you what that would be squared off. And obviously I can change that value so it's not as severe. This one has a little bit of a loop to it. So you can play around with those as options, should you want to. That's a little bit taller of an option. Same thing, we can kind of work through those. So you can play around with those. We go back to 0. We can also, under stroke here, you saw this a little bit before, but we have the ability to change how the corner comes together. So I can change to just have the corner, sorry, there it is at a sharp point. There it is kind of rounded over. We could also do that with these lower points. So I could take this and I could choose under stroke to round the corner. You might not be able to see it under the guide. Let me zoom in here, Control+. Go into stroke here. There they are with their rounded corners. So just a little bit different look. The other thing that we can do is we can use down here under this profile, we can have it get thicker and thinner. So let me zoom out so we can see the whole thing. Right, where it's coming down to a sharp point, but it gets thicker in the middle and goes back. All of these profiles, thick to thin. Right, that one's a little bit sharper, so you can play around with any one of these profiles that you want, because that may or may not get you the look that you're after. In terms of what I'm interested in you practicing with, it's merely the shapes. I don't care what the letters look like, I just want the shapes. But some people like to extend it a little bit further, so I like to introduce that as a concept. The other thing that we can do with the width profile here is we can come over into our, sorry, it's right here, it's called the width tool. It looks kind of like a banana slug with a line on it. That's the only way I can describe it. And we can customize a particular width. So we could take, use a different letter. Right, we could say that at this point on the C, I want the C to be fatter. And down here at the end, I want it to come to a point, and I want it to come to a point here as well. So we just kind of hover over and close that off. We can come over to the D and we could say, I want this corner down here to be kind of fatter, like that. So you can customize any one of these shapes with the width tool, should you want to. Okay, again, not required as part of what we're doing today, but I like to introduce that as a concept. We'll come back and revisit this a little bit later on, but it may be something that you're interested in.
But it has to be one line.
So if we had it made where it was separate lines, then we'd have to apply the width tool to them, to both of them. So let's come back here to our A, which was two separate lines. I have the line that goes up and over, and I have the crossbar. So in this case, let's go back to, I'm going to go to uniform, and I'll come over to the width tool and I'll say, you know what, I want this point to get thicker, like that. Well, it doesn't affect that until I come down here and drag and adjust the width tool there. So maybe I want that to look that way. So it's independent per line. So it's not gonna change this and that at the same time. Does that make sense?
Yes, I thought maybe we can join them and then it will be the same.
Right, so you can join lines together like I did on the S, but if you have a line that is continuous that goes through a point, and then you have another line that crosses it or meets at a T intersection, you can't join those together. So we could apply a width profile to both of them if we selected them. Let's come over to the E, for example. So I could say, let's select both of these, and then I could come over into my stroke. I could come down to a width profile, and I could apply a particular width profile to them. But it's going to apply it to this line as a continuous line and this line as a separate line, because they meet at a T intersection. So in that scenario, I don't know that it's the most effective, but you can apply it to two at the same time. It just doesn't necessarily. On this one, I don't like the fact that it's getting thick and going to thin. So maybe I can flip it like that. There's a button right next to it that lets you flip it so that it starts thick and gets thinner. Just a different strategy. So again, all of those customizations, those are optional. That's not what I really care about today. What I care about today is getting practice with the pen tool, getting comfortable with the pen tool, and working through these letters. There's a reason that I want you to work with the pen tool and get comfortable with it, because it's a skill that long-term you're going to need to have. And so taking the time today to get the practice, remember, this is designed to take about 2 hours. I want you to work on it for 2 hours. So don't rush through it. Take time, get comfortable, create some letters with shapes as backgrounds, convert points to smooth, to angle. Those are all really important skills to kind of build and develop going forward. Okay? So I know I was a little bit short today. Congratulations. We have a short lecture today. But what I want is I want you to spend the extra time and really work on this and get comfortable with it. Okay. It sounded like a few of you have already started, which is fantastic. I'll stick around, and if you guys have any questions, you're more than welcome to ask me. or if you want to come back to one of the check-ins today, even if you came on Monday because you're having trouble with the pen tool, remember the pen tool is hard and it takes practice. So if you need specific, help with it, come to one of the sessions today. I'll be around. Okay. So with that, I'll let you go. I hope you guys have a great weekend. I know it's still a few days away, but have a good weekend, and I'll see you on Monday, or I'll see you during check-ins today.